Tell you something. If you two ever bother me again the rest of my life, I ain't giving up that shit. I can't. There's good friends of mine out there fucking shit. Well, he's the boss, you have to do his part. That's why I said to you before, you don't understand what the money is. I want to know that the boss is your boss.
And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. We are going to get into the final segment for this week, and I believe probably next week. And then we've got some special stuff, some new segments planned, which I think all of you are going to like. And we will get back to some rat files and stuff like that. And I know Dean is probably clapping because that's, I think, his favorite part. So we're going to jump into Philadelphia today and probably continue it next week, and then we'll have new stuff coming your way. And we are going to be releasing these a little bit on YouTube, like I said. So do me a favor, if you like the visual aspects of that, shoot me an email at mobtalkradioshow@gmail.com and give me your thoughts. Also, if you have any show ideas, feel free to reach out, or any new segment ideas you think would be cool to have, let me know. I'm always looking for a little inspiration from outside sources. So all that being said, last week, we talked about the issues that came for Sabella, and it seems like every boss after that had similar issues. Being strong began to wane. And then when this, then the street sort of dictates what happens next. Polino was no different in that regard. And he had the serious beef with Angelo Bruno. We talked about the commission meeting where Angelo either lied about Polina or told a half-truth, attempting to get Polina killed so he could take over. And it put the commission in a bind, but they would settle that somewhat, albeit fairly. And it would lead to the rise of Angelo Annaloro, who would be known as Angelo Bruno. Bruno's rise, or would-be rise, didn't come naturally. Most guys toil in the streets trying to impress the captains and the bosses. But Bruno was a guy who went from being a soldier to a boss, and it's not that often that the transition happens that way, or getting upped happens that way. Bruno's idea of sending more money than anybody else from Philadelphia to New York made a statement. And it brought friendships and business partnerships that Angelo Bruno desperately wanted and desperately would need. And it probably was the only way that Bruno could succeed Polino without shooting him in the streets, I mean, to be perfectly honest. And while it can't be viewed as Machiavellian, or maybe it can be viewed a little Machiavellian to some extent, it truly wasn't the big Machiavellian move that Bruno could have made, or should have made. So in 1956, Marco Reginelli keels over, and that's the same year that Harry Riccobene takes a long-term pinch for narcotics trafficking. And with those two being off the streets, or off the map, gonna sneeze. Excuse me. With those two being off the map, it lights a path for Bruno. Polina has his share of issues in 56 too, and Joe Ida would leave. And not many within Philadelphia, especially South Philly, guys like Ignazio Denaro and Frank Nicoletti, they didn't want the fucking job. They saw the job and the trappings of the job and the feds ramping up. And nobody really wanted the headaches. And so with nobody stepping up, who's gonna step up? And while others sat back wondering, Bruno knew the more money that I send up 95 North, the better off I'm gonna be. The fact that Bruno is sending suitcases in a time period of Cosa Nostra history in the 1950s, which was largely not the best decade for the mob and money, Bruno knew that if he did that, he could and would buy friendships, and he would align like-minded men, greed, in other words. And he was able to keep himself isolated through bribes and payoffs as well. And money was the total equalizer, and he knew it. Money controlled everything, and I mean everything. So Angelo Annaloro, whose surname was actually Azzalora. A lot of people don't know that. It wasn't Annaloro. It was Azzalora. And the name Azzalora, could be dated back to the 1390s in Sicily. And anyway, as we know, he was born in 1910 in Villa Labla, Sicily. Angelo's father, Michael Annaloro, was born as well in Villa Alba, Sicily. And while it was a mafia enclave, Michael wanted nothing to do with the honored society. The man on the top of the mountain in those days was Calogero Vizzini, who had assisted in the Allied forces during the war. Michael didn't have a lot of options, but some of his family had immigrated to the United States, so he leaves Italy for America in 1906. He first heads to Trenton, New Jersey after arriving in New York, and just goes to work. And over the years, he would head back to Sicily, would get engaged, have children, and it's not until 1911 that his wife and his children arrive from Italy to New York City. His wife, Vincentina, would arrive with Josephine and a spry 1-year-old by the name of Angelo. 2 more children would come years later, Vito and Michelina. And they would settle in South Philadelphia, just adjacent to 4th Street, just a block from a big kosher market. Little Italy was just a couple of blocks away. And the main language spoken in that neighborhood was Sicilian and Yiddish. And this is how Angelo picks up speaking Yiddish fluently, which would serve him years later. His father, Michael, wanted to own a grocery store, and much like many of the other Sicilians who now called Philadelphia home, Michael would go to the Italian Grocers Association of the Delaware Valley for some help opening up his store. And they would also help him import anything he needed, be it domestic, imported, to ensure that he had the same goods as everybody else had that also owned grocery stores. Angelo would end up attending Campbell Lyons Elementary and would be accepted into the Settlement Music School. And that school was like a magnet school for musicians and singers, but Angelo refused to go, even though he was very good at singing. And by all accounts, Angelo was a decent student. He was good with the ladies. And Angelo knew he also had to help his father with work. And in those days, and we've heard it a million times before, you were just expected to be like a second father and bring a second income into the family to help the family survive. And while Angelo's father had bumped up against the mafia in Philadelphia, he never really wanted anything to do with them. He avoided them as much as he could. And by all accounts, he could have made his life easier for his family by getting loans when times got tough, but he refused. And it was all on his shoulders or nothing at all. Angelo would graduate South Philadelphia High School in March of 1926, and Angelo had grown up toiling in his father's grocery shop, and at the end of the day, he just wanted a different life for himself. Sweeping up, carrying groceries, it was boring. I mean, in Center City, there was a nightlife. There was a different part of the world that he wanted to be in. And when he's 16, he gets his license, has a car, and begins to hang out in Center City nightclubs. And right around this time is when Prohibition kicks in, and Angelo sees them drinking and carousing without any interference from the cops. And Angelo also saw the sheer amounts of money that were being made as a result of that. And Angelo saw the cars, he saw the money, the nightlife, the women, and it was intoxicating, and that's what he wanted. And so while Angelo wanted a better life for himself, he did not have an in into the mafia. And he begins to ask around where he could find a little side gig. And a couple of small side gigs came from mob guys. And it was nothing big, but they took a liking to Angelo. And his closest friend growing up was Ralphie Maranca, who lived just down the block and whose family owned a local dry macaroni store. And on the side, they were making illegal booze. The Marancas were not Sicilian. They were actually Abruzzi, and Angelo began to form a crush on Susie Maranca, who was the sister of Ralphie. And her parents, the father didn't have so much of an issue. He didn't care that Angelo was Sicilian, but the mother absolutely wanted nothing to do with anybody that was Sicilian. But the Marancas, however, had a secret. They were in the booze business, and Mr. Maranca would have cared less if Angelo was Sicilian or not, because it was the wife who didn't like Sicilians, didn't trust Sicilians, but he allowed Angelo to help with the secretive booze business and date the girl on the sly. And so when Prohibition hits Philadelphia, It wasn't the same like it was in New York or Chicago or Boston. Murders in other cities were paramount, whereas in Philadelphia, nobody really went out of the way to kill anybody, especially over booze. Sure, you would get the random bar patron getting loaded up and killing somebody, but you didn't have the widespread mayhem of murder like you did in other cities with people competing for bootlegging turf. As we know historically, Max Boo Boo Hoff had really cornered the market in Philadelphia, but one of the reasons why you didn't see the widespread violence was because Philadelphia's booze laws were very loose, and it wasn't considered a big deal. And this is why everybody seemed to get involved. At one time or another, it seemed like everybody was involved in some capacity or another in the booze business. And Max Boo Boo Hoff didn't care because his bottom line was 10 times what anybody else could earn. And so he saw it as not a big deal if a few punk teens wanted to make a couple extra bucks. It just didn't affect his bottom line. In fact, teens selling or making booze, collecting bottles, it sort of became a melting pot of a draft for Hoff and the Mafia. And those would be the guys that would get drafted into the big leagues of the mob. So in 1928, Angelo Bruno takes his first arrest. It was a simple arrest, and after that arrest, he changes his name to Bruno. Gone was Annaloro, and in was Bruno. And Bruno was his mother's middle name, her maiden name. By 1932, Bruno would be married to Susie Maranca. And Bruno at the time was just shy of 22, and he would then get more directly involved in the Maranca's illegal booze distillery. And Bruno's ability to bridge gaps in other neighborhoods with Jews, African Americans, and Hispanics and other Italians was really what he was good at. And he was able to sell illegal booze to everybody. He didn't see color, he didn't see race, he didn't see religious views. The fact that he spoke Yiddish opened doors for him in other areas which no other gangster had ever gone. And they trusted Angelo. And so when the Volstead Act, or Prohibition, was repealed in 1933, Angelo Bruno continues on with the booze business. Bruno's business acumen was second to none, and he outbid and he outflanked everybody else who was in that business. Bruno knew that it wasn't a crate of booze, but 10,000 crates of booze that truly mattered. And he could underscore everyone else in the business by offering cheaper booze at better prices, obviously. And what ends up happening as a result is legitimate places, bars and taverns, end up buying their booze from Angelo Bruno because it was cheaper and the quality was just as good as everybody else's. And so Little Italy in South Philadelphia was the hub of big-time booze distributors, like the Lanzettis and the Sabella faction. And with the violence between the groups, smaller bootleggers could provide a service for the bigger bootleggers in the city. So if they're not getting a certain shipment on time, they can go to guys like Angelo Bruno and some of the younger guys and get their booze from them. So not only is that good for business, but the bigger groups would end up protecting the smaller bootleggers just by proxy, because they know if they get into a jam, they're going to need their help. And this is where kind of Bruno makes his bones. And so back when Bruno gets pinched in 1928, he was lucky he didn't get deported. And it was actually Angelo's arrest which put a huge wedge between father and son. And Angelo was so upset with his father, he changed his last name. And that was the end of their relationship. And it divided the family in two. Michael viewed his son's arrest as petty and embarrassing to the family. And Angelo didn't see it that way. Angelo's father, Michael, had worked hard to achieve whatever he had. And Angelo taking a shortcut brought shame to the family. Even though Angelo stayed in his father's business, sweeping up, cleaning stock shelves, the two did not speak. And with the booze business getting even bigger, Angelo and his brother-in-law now, Ralphie Maranca, would hire a couple of guys to help because the operation was just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And they ended up getting a distillery off of 8th and Federal Streets in Little Italy. However, the cops were watching. And what ends up happening is a few beat cops in Philadelphia notified state and local federal offices that there was a 500-gallon still located at 8th and Federal. And it likely probably came from a snitch in the neighborhood because there was a lot of petty jealousy going on in those days. And somebody obviously had tipped them off. And when the agents stormed the facility, they found 13 5-gallon cans of white liquor that was ready to be distributed. The load of 2,000 gallons of mash was caught early in the distilling process, and the agents, in fact, destroyed it. On top of it, Bruno was 25 at the time. and he was charged with violating federal firearms acts along with other offenses which involved the alcohol production. Angelo Bruno, his brother Vito, and Joe Lumio all get arrested at the same time. And if Bruno wanted to deflect or try to even to deny, it was hard for him to do. Not only did he own the building in his name, but the property as well. So saying he didn't know what was going on just wouldn't work out for him. He would be arrested, he would be booked, and bail would be set. A few days into his confinement, a stranger from 7th and Catherine bailed Angelo out, along with Joe Lumio. However, his brother Vito was not bailed out. And obviously, it was a gangster that did this. Bruno at first would plead not guilty, and then he decides to wait for trial. Trial would be scheduled for January of 1936, and in October, as the preliminary hearings would begin. It was bad. Bruno knew that the evidence they had, there's nothing he could do to get under it. Just with the confiscation of goods and the machinery was enough to bury him, and he knew it. And so by November, some 7 months after his initial arrest, Bruno arranges for a plea deal. He would agree to serve 15 months suspended sentence and 3 years probation. And that's a deal that anybody would take. No jail time, no prison, no fines, no nothing. That arrest and then the subsequent resolution of all of that gave Bruno a reputation on the streets. He didn't squeal. He didn't talk. He took his medicine and he got a good deal. He showed that he was able to avoid prison. The streets were all watching, and the made guys were watching how Angelo handled himself in that situation and how he conducted himself. Most men in that position might talk or might get anxious and scared, and Angelo never flinched. Surely he could have made things easier for himself by dropping a dime on other people, but he didn't utter a fucking word. And he did what honorable men at that time did. And guys within John Avena's faction began to notice Angelo Bruno. Not only could he speak well, he conducted business well, but it appeared that he knew how to make money and stay low-key. While other guys had to start or wanted to just be gophers and just did favors for mob guys, Bruno did neither one. He went out and he did it for himself, and that is the difference between him and a lot of other guys. Guys, let me run errands for you. You pay me 10 a week. Okay, fine. Bruno didn't need that. He didn't want a handout. He wanted to prove it to himself and to everybody else on the streets. He was independent and could do whatever he wanted. And that's basically what he does. And the thing is, you didn't need to ask Bruno for a favor or to go get this or that. He took the initiative in and of himself. And the fact that he carried a burner with him, a gun, told everybody in the streets he was no punk. Even if the Annaloro family had relatives back in Sicily who were involved in the mafia, that's not something that Angelo used nor Michael ever used. His father loathed them, but that connection with the roots back into Sicily you would think would only help Angelo's reputation, but it really didn't matter. And at the time, John Avena would bring in anybody who was Italian. Things had changed from the Sabella days. It didn't matter if you were Abruzzi, Calabrese, didn't matter. What mattered most to John Avena was not lineage, not which town or which village you came from, but could you earn fucking money? To show that Avena was different, Avena brings in Marco Reginelli. He's Abruzzi. Skinny Razor, Abruzzi. Joe Ragnetta, Calabrese. Joe Ida, Calabrese. Dominic Festa, Calabrese. And as we said a few shows back, Avena didn't care. As long as you could make money, and it's that sort of decision or that sort of stance that he took that was very Lucky Luciano-like. And it's that decision that turned off old world Sicilians. It was all about capitalism, not culture. And so Bruno was right at the right place in the right time. And there is a bit of a discrepancy of just when Bruno gets inducted into the mob. Most say that it came under the reign of John Avena. However, I am sort of friendly with some of Angelo's relatives who told me that it wasn't under Avena, but rather much later on. And that kind of coincides with some FBI reports that I have. And the first story that really kind of ever came out was that Bruno made his bones in 1935 and then was accepted into Avena's family. But either way, it really doesn't matter because we know he got made. We're never going to get the exact date. But what we do know is that Bruno formed deep alliances with other Italian mobsters and Jewish gangsters. And he very much emulated what John Avena did in terms of acting independent and not being afraid to go into other neighborhoods and form friendships and business contacts and associates, which opened doors to other illicit income. Bruno also ventured into business with other gangsters from other cities. And that was the difference between the two. Avena stuck to home, and Bruno wanted to venture out to form alliances in New York. It meant more opportunities, more money, nothing more, nothing less. So within Philadelphia, each boss came with a different set of beliefs. Harry Riccobene would tell the FBI that with Sicilians, men were made on the basis of inner relationships or kinship with other Sicilian gangsters, meaning related. With Sabella, Riccobene would tell the FBI that murder was not a specific prerequisite, but it was understood and expected that if you should be asked to do that, you would do it. With John Avena, new rules got handed down in 1931 from Lucky Luciano, and I don't know if anybody knows this. Luciano was the one who put the rule in that murder was a rule. You had to be involved in a murder to even be admitted into organized crime. That was Luciano's deal. And also the new thing was that at the initiation ceremony, a gun and a knife would be presented and a saint would be burned as a reminder that murder is a part of this job. Luciano invented that. That's not something Luciano brought from Sicily. That is something that Luciano came up with. And it's interesting when you look historically because, and maybe the roots came from Sicily in sort of initiation rites, but Luciano devises the gun, the pistol, the saint. And it's funny because there is an initiation ceremony that got caught over in Italy, and they're doing the same thing. So I don't know if it transferred back over there or whether Luciano historically knew certain things and just applied it, but that was never before a thing in the United States with the gun and the pistol. So in the early days, Bruno was a feared guy on the block. Later years, not so much. But in 1935, an arrest suggests to us that he might have murdered or was willing to. And it was all over the street. That's all the credibility he needed. It didn't matter if he pulled the trigger or not. The fact that he carried a gun and people thought he would was enough to give him credibility. It gave him a reputation, and that's really all you need. You have to be feared, or you have to make people suspect that you might get violent. And that's usually enough to keep people weary of you and keep them in line. Within the Mafia, however, Bruno was not feared. Guys like Skinny Razor, Harry Riccobene, Joe Casella, Joe Scafidi, those are the guys that were truly feared and respected. Harry Riccobene would remark years later when asked about Bruno, he would say he wasn't tough. He didn't have a spine. He wanted to be the boss, but he just wasn't born into this. He had to be taught our culture. He had to be taught the ways of the mob. And that gave everybody else a heads up over them. And Riccobene wasn't far off that mark because, like I said, others were brought up in it. They were taught. They were groomed. That is their life. And Bruno wasn't. He had to learn from others. He had to learn on the fly. And his lack of knowledge about the tradition and the words, the phrases, the techniques of fear were all things that he had to learn. And it meant that anybody who was groomed or anybody who was born into it by lineage had a massive advantage over Bruno in the streets. And Bruno knew it. Bruno knew it. Guys like Casella and Harry Riccobene, they didn't have to think. They honored the boss, killed without question, and Bruno could learn that, but it wasn't instilled in him from childhood. And so after his 1936 conviction, he didn't stop the booze business. He just kept going. And he slowly begins to learn how to place bets, writes the numbers. But with the booze truly being his income, he didn't have time for simple, small, anti-penny bets. And then he realized, why waste time on these stupid penny bets when I could take bigger bets than anybody else? And he would try to establish gaming and the numbers rackets in different parts of the city where mobsters would not go. He went to the black communities where Italians wouldn't go. And he says, I'm going to set up an operation here. And he did this for two reasons. Number one, nobody had tried at any point to get the blue-collar workers to take bets or to place bets or to play the numbers. And number two, doing that kept him from encroaching into other people's turf and creating beefs. Where Italians wouldn't work with the Jews or the blacks or the Hispanics, Bruno would. Bruno would take a pinch for being what the police deemed a disorderly person. And Bruno pays a $10 fine and walks. And it only meant that the cops were beginning to watch him because he's moving into other areas. In 1940, he takes another pinch. Police acting on information received, police go to 1905 South Broad Street to a first-floor apartment. When they enter the door, they find bedding slips on the bed, bedding slips on the dresser, bedding slips behind the mirrors, and all over the fucking apartment. 2,000 slips were found in a 2-bedroom apartment that was registered to Angelo Bruno, the place he called home. Once the police come in and they confront Bruno, Bruno admits, at least according to the police, that he had been up for 2 days tallying all of the slips. Bruno said later on that he never said any of that. He never uttered a word to them. But they end up arresting Bruno and they put him into jail. And for 10 days, he sits there with no bail. And Bruno, whose father had just died, explained to the court that he was not a numbers operator, but a simple grocer who ran 2 stores with his mother because of his father's death. And it doesn't matter. He's found guilty. And when the judge asks Bruno if he had anything to say before sentencing, he once again laments that he simply ran 2 stores and promised never ever to be in front of that judge ever again. And the judge, instead of hammering him, sentences him to 1 year probation. That's another slap on the wrist, one he could have avoided had Bruno just invested in paying off the cops. And it's after this arrest that he's never going to take a pinch like that again, and he's going to start paying the cops. So at the time of that last arrest, Joe Bruno was the boss, but it really didn't matter. The tenure of Havana to Ida, everyone was basically on their own and had to watch their own backs. And one thing Angelo never did was use his buddies within the mafia for help on his own cases. He didn't feel that his arrests were the business of the mafia, and he made sure to resolve those issues through his own negotiations and never asked the hierarchy for advice or help. He did it on his own, and it showed that he was independent and that he could handle his own business, and he's not bringing attention to it. Bruno also had important relationships and business relationships with Jewish gangsters. He found that they worked well together, had the same mindset, and the bottom line was being independent and forging business ties that made everybody that was involved wealthy without the trapping of 10 hands in the same cookie jar. Bruno felt that the Jewish gangsters in general had more business acumen and a better feel for legitimate businesses than anything else. So he learned from them how to legitimize himself. You know, the Italians were all conglomerized into families. This brigada, that brigada, this crew, that crew. And they just didn't work together as one big entity. Whereas the Jewish mafia, they defended one another without hesitation. Didn't matter whose crew you were in. Oh, the Italians are fucking with these guys. Okay, now they're fucking with all the Jews. That's how the Jewish guys looked at things. And it made the Jewish mafia stronger during that time period in South Philadelphia than any other Italian mob in the city. And it more or less meant, from Bruno's perspective, that after 1940, he could fend for himself and he didn't have to answer to anybody. And what does he do? He begins paying off the cops, the magistrates, and that enables his gambling rackets to explode without the interference of law enforcement and prosecutions. But if there was a red flag, it wasn't a flag that mirrored back to Bruno. It was just a sign of those in the streets that Bruno was determined to outshine everybody else. So him paying off cops should have been a red flag of, okay, he's starting to gain stature and money. And so to outsiders who had petty jealousy or didn't want him to rise or thought anything about him, that should have been a red flag to them. But to the rest of organized crime, like in New York, it just shows that he's handling his business and that he has valuable criminal assets to protect. That should have told the guys that didn't like him, wait a minute, he's starting to gain some steam here. Why is he going to pay off the cops if he's only got one numbers racket? He's protecting his businesses, which should have told them the motherfucker's rising. And if they weren't watching, they fucking should have been. And what happens? Cops begin to watch. Prosecutors tried to watch. And nobody understood how Bruno was attaining power without firing a gun, without causing a turf war within the gambling rackets. And the truth is, Bruno was deriving his power from owning the criminal justice system in South Philadelphia. And that's just the truth. And the 1940s were a big decade for Bruno. Not only does he get drafted into World War II, but he becomes a father. And while all of those things are different little highlights of his life, the relationships that he cultivates in the 1940s are paramount to what he becomes in the late 1950s. Bruno begins to expand into Trenton, and he would make friendships and alliances with others like Sam the plumber DeCavalcante. At the time, as we know, Sam becomes the boss of the DeCavalcante crime family, but at the time, he was just a made guy whose father was the one of the main guys in Jersey. And Sam at the time was in a partnership with Johnny Keys Simone. And they had some business together, and they owned Atlas Extermination Services. And they had a few contracts, like we've said a couple weeks ago, within the Trenton Police Department to remove roaches from a certain section of the precinct. The thing is, though, the Trenton Police Department were corrupt and had been protecting the mafia for decades. Sam the plumber owned the Trenton Police Department. He owned them. Johnny Key Simone, actually, believe it or not, was related to Angelo Bruno. They were third cousins and only met by accident. Simone was born in Florence, Pennsylvania, but had actually spent most of his life after he was born in upstate New York in Niagara. Simone had a rap sheet that just went on and on and on, and judges called him a juvenile delinquent before he ever turned 14. His first arrest for truancy got him 10 months in an industrial prison. What fucking kid gets 10 months in prison for skipping school? Who fucking does that? State and federal arrests would follow that, ranging from smuggling to robberies, 3 different robberies, disorderly conduct, but somehow he escapes all of it. The justice system would finally, hammer Simone in his ass in Cleveland, Ohio in 1935 for attempting to assault with intent to rob. And he ends up getting sent away for the next 5 years, and he exits prison in 1941. And when he gets out is when he meets Angelo Bruno, because Simone was in South Philadelphia using the alias of John Perna or John Casablanca. And he uses those aliases because he was working for Marco Reginelli at Reginelli's nightclub called Casablanca Nightclub in New Jersey. And it didn't take long for the local cops to begin to notice Simone, and they were on his ass for the rest of his life. FBI informants at the time would tell the cops that Simone would do anything for money, anything at all. And Bruno at times would feel bad for him and offer him a place to stay and give him money for small jobs. And it was tough for Simone in the 1940s because the cops just wouldn't fucking leave the guy alone. And they just harassed him nonstop. Or they arrested him for bullshit crimes, or he'd get caught operating a still here and there. And he ends up getting sent away to Danbury, then Lewisburg. The same exact crimes that Angelo Bruno committed. But Angelo Bruno walked from them crimes. Simone didn't. Because Simone didn't have the money to pay off cops. And because of his reputation, nobody would cut him any fucking slack. And so the reason why I'm going to stop here is because something big is going to really start happening. We're going to dive into this whole commission beef between Polina and Bruno. And you're going to see and hear probably for the first time how crafty Angelo Bruno really was. Because oftentimes when we discuss Angelo Bruno, nobody really knows a lot about his childhood. Nobody's ever done shows about that, except for me. And you realize that Bruno wasn't just some softy, wasn't a punk. He was a very highly intelligent guy. But what you're going to find is that Bruno has the same problem that every motherfucking boss before him in the history of Cosa Nostra in Philadelphia has. They forget where they come from. They forget the struggle. And yeah, there's a evolutionary, push and pull with organized crime as it evolves and changes. But from Merlino to Stampa to fucking Natali to fucking Scarfo to Testa to Bruno. I mean, it just, none of these guys learned. And it seems like, it honest to God seems to me like after Sabella, nobody got it. Nobody was ever uber successful. Now, granted, Bruno's probably got the best run out of all of them. I got to admit it. But it's how Bruno dies and why he dies that I get confused about. Because this is a guy who came up in the 20s and the 30s who saw crazy shit, and he knew about the Castellamare War and toiled in that and did everything he could do. He seemed a step ahead of everybody else. And his viewpoint was, you know, he was nicknamed the Docile Don because he didn't like using murder as an equalizer because he saw what it did to Philadelphia. But the crop of guys that are coming up, like Sabella said, not 30 years before, the guys that are coming up have no foundational understanding of how this works. The minute that you allow the Calabres, the Neapolitan, the Abruzzi to come in, it all goes to shit because they don't understand the tradition. They don't understand the foundations. And there's a good argument to say that that's accurate. Because if you look, Angelo Bruno owned unions. Nicky Scarfo controlled unions. After Nicky Scarfo, they can't control which way their fucking stream comes out of their dick. And I'm not knocking them saying they're unintelligent or they're not smart. But it's just a core group of guys that came up that just don't have the lineage. They just don't. And that's what makes Philadelphia a very interesting psychological viewpoint when we talk about organized crime and the mentality of it all. We have not seen in Philadelphia since probably, Marco Reginelli or Joe Crutch. We haven't seen somebody in Philadelphia that is a fucking monster gangster. Somebody that's got his hands in everything until now. And I'm not gonna expand on that or expound on that at all. But I'm telling you, by the time we're done with this series, you're going to understand Philadelphia like I do. And this is why I'm so good at talking about Philadelphia. And that's what people have told me. They're like, how do you have them pegged? You understand everything. It's because I learned from history. And you have to be a student of the game. And you have to see what made Sabella successful, what made Joe Ida successful, and then what is their downfall? What happened that put them in the positions they were in? How did Angelo Bruno get into the position? He only got there because Harry Riccobene and Joe Casella are away in prison. And he knows by sending a ton of cash back to New York, that that's truly the mark of somebody they want to be with. And the proof that he relied on money for foundational friendships and alliances is only proven by the fact that after Gambino dies, they kill him. They never would have done that shit if Carlo Gambino was alive. That money brought Gambino a friendship. Well, it bought Bruno the friendship. But Philadelphia's never really truly been respected by New York. They're certainly not now, I can tell you that for a fact. But in those early days, there were men that were leaders that were respected. And now they're a laughing stock. And that's the tough part about Philadelphia, because you got some real high acumen street guys there. I'm not going to lie to you. They're all violent, okay? But there are 5 or 6 that I could riddle off, which I'm not going to, that are highly intelligent individuals. And if they had just put, their intelligence to legitimate shit, they'd be huge successes. But the problem is when the head of the snake is rotting, it filters down and infests the rest of the body. And even if they don't agree with what is going on, what can they really do? And yeah, sure, we could talk the politics and the history. Well, you kill the prick. You kill the guy and you take over. Can't do that anymore, especially with the climate and everything that goes on and, cameras in every corner. And that's my thing. I think that a lot of people, and some of you right now, the light bulb's going to go off. I don't think the underlings or the captains or the underboss or the conciliere, I don't think they like what's going on in Philadelphia. But as long as the puppet is going to keep talking, the focus is on that and they can do what they need to do. Because at the end of the day, the head of the snake is the one that's getting cut off. And in some ways, go ahead, throw yourself out there, pal. Good luck. Because at the end of the day, when that jail cell door closes on that guy, it's lights out. He's done. 61 years old, he's going to take a huge pinch. He's done. And he's going to find out that he never really had any power. The power that he derives comes from the men behind him. And when you are a boss of anything, you are only as strong as the men around you. But at the same token, you have got to instill fear on your own. And if nobody fears you, but they fear your men, that's a problem. And I wrote this quote. I wrote this myself, and this is what I wanted to read to do the final part of the show. And this applies to Philadelphia, and this applies to criminality. It applies to business. A man is only as powerful as the guards outside of the gate. An egotistical ruler falls asleep while riding the horse, only to be decapitated by his enemies. I'll read it again. A man is only as powerful as the guards outside of the gate. An egotistical ruler falls asleep while riding the horse, only to be decapitated by his enemies. A man that relies on everyone around him to keep him insulated is bound for death. Because you get lulled to sleep off the fat of the lamb, they used to say. So write this quote down. This is an original Jeff Canarsie quote, and use it wherever you need to. A man is only, I don't know why I'm stuttering here. A man is only as powerful as the guards outside of the gate. An egotistical ruler falls asleep while riding the horse, only to be decapitated by his enemies. Meaning that those who are protecting you outside of the gate, if they get fed up with your impetuous behavior and your ego, they open the gates. Or you think they're riding with you into the forest to hunt, and when you turn your head to look, they're not there. That's how organized crime is. That's how it's always going to be. And that's going to be it for this week on Mob Talk Radio. If you like the quote, go ahead and email me, mobtalkradioshow@gmail.com, and we can talk about it. We will be doing a live this weekend, not sure which day. Keep it dialed into YouTube or our Facebook page for that. All that being said, until we meet again,